Did you ever do that DNA test?
I did do the DNA test, and then I promptly deleted all of my data from that site.
Well, did you save a copy of it at least?
Yes, I absolutely did, because I want it for my future generations.
Did you learn anything interesting from yours?
I have a lot more French blood in me than I anticipated.
I think it's as a surprise to no one with my last name. Mine revealed a significant amount of Mexican.
I know.
So
you have a lot of Mexican heritage.
Well, yes. I have more Volga German, but significant amount of Mexican, which I've, been able to trace all the way back to around the year 1200-ish.
Wow.
So pretty exciting.
You're listening to Dot Femme.
Welcome to Dot Femme. I'm your host, Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire.
And today we're talking about, well, why don't you tell us what we're talking about today, Claire?
We are discussing the persons whose name is Amelio Robles, and they are a president. No, they're not the president.
They're not the president. No, we're discussing Colonel Amelio Robles Ávila.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
He was a trans man in the Mexican Revolution.
Oh.
So
very good.
But in order to talk about Colonel Robles, we first have to talk about the Mexican Revolution a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a story of a war and intrigue.
Yeah, and we got to set the stage.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing we learned last episode, it's that all of history is kind of connected. I know, right? Crazy. So, Mexican Revolution started in the very late 1800s. I guess the actual revolution itself started at like 1911, but the stage was set in like 1898 or something like that. Porfirio Diaz was the president of Mexico almost continuously. There was a brief period of time where he, I guess, my understanding, and I may have misread this in my research, but my understanding was that at the time he was president, and then he was constitutionally barred from running for president again. So he had kind of like a lackey or a sycophant run in his place, and that person became president and then allowed the Constitution to be amended so that Diaz could be president again. And then he was. So when we say almost continuously, that's kind of what we mean. There was a brief period where he wasn't president, and then he was again, up until about 1911.
I'm glad that we have a constitution that forbids people from running more than 2 terms.
Yeah, for now.
Anyway, go on.
So this was a period called the Porfiriato. Porfirio Diaz was a president known for rigging elections. He seized a bunch of land from local peasants using an armed militia called the Rurales, and he consolidated a lot of power.
Wild.
During this period, during the Porfiriato, over 90% of the communal land was seized and sold to private wealthy landowners called hacendados.
It all comes back to landlords. It always comes back to landlords.
Yeah. An estimated 9.5 million peasants were forced into the service of these hacendados.
Wow.
In 1910, Francisco Madero, who himself was from a wealthy hacendado family, he ran against Diaz for the presidency. During this time, Diaz tried to ensure that Madero wouldn't win, so he had him jailed in the election.
Wow.
But despite this, Madero ended up winning. And while he was in jail, or this might have been after he was released from jail, but kind of forced into exile briefly in San Antonio, Texas, he wrote a letter called the Plan de San Luis Potosí. And in that letter, he declared that Diaz's presidency was illegal, and he called for a revolt against him. And this kind of ignited a series of disparate revolutionary movements across Mexico. They weren't all cleanly unified, but ultimately they were successful because the federal army, the Federales, were kind of a weak and incompetent unit at this time, and they just kind of had an inability to suppress these revolutionary movements. So
and Maduro was still in jail when this kind of was going on, right? Like
Madero was, I believe he was at this point in time, he was in self-imposed exile in San Antonio, Texas, I think.
Got it.
So
interesting.
After the Federales' defeat, Diaz and Madero ended up signing the Treaty of Ciudad Juarez on May 21st, 1911. This treaty stated that Diaz would abdicate the presidency, but did not allow Madero to accede to the presidency. Instead, it appointed an interim president, Francisco León de la Barra, and he would hold that office until they could hold elections later that year in October. Madero ran in those elections, and he won. So Madero became the president of Mexico at this time. But he continued to face rebellions his entire time in office because a lot of the revolutionaries who helped bring Madero to power were pretty unsatisfied with a lot of aspects of the previous regime that Madero just kind of left in place. And they were also just kind of unhappy with Madero's inexperience as a politician. He didn't seem to be very effective. So, you know, the disjointed revolutionaries that helped him become president, who were now being called the Constitutionalists, were opposing Madero. So in some way, Madero did, after the revolution, what he never could during the revolution, which was unite all of the revolutionaries.
Wow, that's a twist.
Yeah, I suppose. One of Madero's generals, General Huerta, Victoriano Huerta, ended up leading a military coup and overthrows Madero. And this almost immediately breaks out into a civil war. And it was mostly in the north at first, but it kind of spreads across the country. And shortly after that, in 1914, the Federales are defeated once again by the Constitutionalist forces. Huerta is deposed, and the Federales are disbanded towards the end of 1914. So no more federal army at all. After the victory against Huerta, Constitutionalist forces again start to fracture and fall into infighting because they're, you know, trying to figure out who's going to be the next president, how is the new system going to work, and all this stuff. And so it starts essentially a second civil war of sorts that lasts until October of 1915. There continues to be a bunch of infighting until a new constitution is written in 1917, which is the current constitution of Mexico. So we're talking about a period that's pretty
turbulent.
Yeah. So that sets the stage. Now we know what we're talking about, or what time period we're talking about, right? So let's talk about Colonel Robles.
How does he fit into this whole thing?
Robles was born in November of 1889 in Guerrero to a wealthy farming family. They owned 42 hectares of land and a small mezcal factory. I don't know if Robles' family was wealthy enough to be considered hacendados, but they probably could have been.
What does that word mean?
Hacendados?
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Wealthy landowner.
Oh, right. Yeah, so that's the landowner. That's the translation to a landowner.
More or less, yeah. Wealthy landowners, they were called hacendados. So I don't know if Robles' family was wealthy enough to be considered hacendados. I'm sure some people probably did. They did own 42 hectares of land and a small mezcal factory. But suffice it to say, like, Robles' family was relatively important and influential in their local community in Guerrero.
Yeah.
From a young age, Robles showed an interest in activities that were considered, you know, masculine, such as handling weapons, learning to tame and ride horses, and Robles became an excellent marksman and horse rider.
Hell yeah.
Two skills that will be very helpful for him later.
I also enjoy these things.
Sure.
Does that make me masculine?
I mean, I'm sure society views those things as stereotypically more masculine activities.
I know. Intersectionalities between genders. Oh, God.
So, in his early 20s, around the year 1911 or 1912, Robles joins the Revolutionary Army. He's still, remember, Robles was born female. He's a trans man. And at this point in time, he is still presenting as female. More or less. From what I understand, he always asserted his identity as a man, but he didn't start like dressing as a man until a little bit after this. So at this point, he's still presenting as a woman, a young woman.
How old is he at that point in time?
His early 20s. I think like 22, 23, something like that.
A prime age for transition.
Yeah. And it's also very important to know that it was not uncommon for women to join the revolutionary armies and fight. In fact, there was a term for women that fought in the Mexican Revolution, soldaderas. So it wasn't uncommon for a woman to be fighting in the army. So I don't think anyone probably gave Amelio a second thought, you know. A couple years after he joins the army, right around 1913, Robles begins dressing as a man. He demands to be treated as a man. Like we said, a lot of women ended up fighting in the Mexican Revolution, and some of them did end up taking on male identities. Most of them, for example, Angela Jimenez, who went by the name of Angel, she, at least as far as we know, didn't identify as a man because she was trans. She identified as a man to avoid like rape and abuse. But Robles didn't identify as a man for those reasons. He seemed to genuinely be a man. Like he identified as a man. So it's interesting, this kind of complicated interplay of gender that's sort of happening in the Mexican Revolution.
Hold on, Dany. Dany, are you telling me that gender is a social construct right now?
Oh boy. I don't know that you want me to get into that.
I mean...
Okay, here's the thing, and this is my opinion on this, I suppose. But I don't think gender is a social construct.
Oh.
Hold on.
Oh, mic drop. Let's go.
I'm not done. I think gender expectations is a social construct. But I think that gender, one's innate sense of identity as either masculine or feminine or both or somewhere in between, that part,
sure,
I don't think is a social construct. I think if it were, then we wouldn't see children who are like so young that they don't really understand the differences between boys and girls, but they can still, you know, articulate their gender identity. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
So I don't think gender is a social construct. I think gender expectations and stereotypes are the social construct.
I'm giving you snaps.
I think a lot of times we conflate those two things as like gender and gender expectations are the same thing. They're kind of not. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense.
I feel like that's a hot take in the community right now. I feel like I'm going to get canceled for that.
No, not at all. I don't. I think it's something, you know, to sit with and like explore a little bit more, you know, gender, like the expectation of gender, right? You know, like, well, like, so like when we transition, you know, there's this whole idea of like, well, like we shouldn't have to transition at all. We should just be able to be the person that, you know, we've always set out to be. But even then, like from within the trans community, like, you know, especially in my line of work with like the idea of like coming out, passing, voice stuff, like, you know, like some of that conversation is like, okay, how do you actually like start using your new voice? How do you start doing this? And then for some of our students, like they're totally in a liberated sense where all of a sudden they can just use their voice and there's like no coming out process at all. They just, you know, fluidly move into their new way of expressing and, you know, performing gender because there's no one expecting them to behave any other way than themselves. So I don't know. It's just like, it's a whole thing about the liberated trans person, you know, like, and then like the community that you surround yourself with. I do agree with you. Yeah, I think like it's an expectation put on us by others. Right. It's a good way to, you know, kind of summarize it. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's eloquently put. Thank you. I haven't heard it like that way before.
I mean, you know me. I'm a stickler for precision in language.
That's true.
Imprecise language is a pet peeve of mine. You know this.
Yep.
And so I think it's like words mean things.
Do they?
It's very important that we use the right words when we're trying to talk about a thing, because otherwise communication is the process of wirelessly transferring information from my brain to your brain.
This is true.
More or less. And imprecise communication is like, to put it in tech terms, like packet loss, right? I don't know. It's a pet peeve of mine, but we're not going to go into that right now because this is a podcast, not my therapy session.
This episode of Dot Femme is supported by our Patreon, duh. I mean, come on, you think a tiny trans podcast like us would have sponsors? I wish. No, we're supported entirely by our listeners. We're kind of like PBS that way, only queerer. Patreon.com/dotfemme. That's patreon.com/dotfemme.
So for about 5 years, from 1913 to 1918, Amelio Robles Ávila fought as El Colonel Robles with the Zapatistas, which was one of the revolutionary groups. And he actually gained the respect of, I think, pretty much all of his peers and superiors, more or less. There were definitely people that gave him a hard time and, you know, were shitty. But I think by and large, he was viewed by his peers and superiors as like a capable military leader. He was even given his own command.
Cool. He commanded respect.
Yeah, he did.
Dang.
A lot of the missions that he and his men went on included like smuggling weapons and supplies, carrying messages, you know, across the country from one revolutionary army to the other and stuff. Really important work, you know, like things that the revolution would not have been able to succeed without the kind of stuff that he was doing. After Zapata was killed, he was the leader of the Zapatistas, as you might imagine. Robles ended up leading 315 men under his command and joined the forces of Álvaro Obregón to fight in the Agua Prieta revolt, which brought about an end to the Carranza government.
Wow.
In 1924, Robles was injured in a battle against the De la Huertas rebellion. You know, he was pretty active during the revolution, saw, you know, some genuine action, did some really important work. After the revolution, he was attacked by a group of men who wanted to reveal his they wanted to prove whether he was born a woman or not.
Same shit, different era.
Yeah. And during this altercation, Robles killed 2 of these men in self-defense. In 1948, Robles received a medical certificate that was required to officially enter the Confederation of Veterans of the Revolt. The certificate confirmed that he had received 6 bullet wounds during his time in the army. He was shot at least 6 times.
Wait, did he get thrown in prison or anything for killing those people?
I don't know. I don't think so.
So he got off scotch-free because it was under self-defense?
They attacked him and he killed them. So, I mean, the same thing happens in this country.
It should.
It's supposed to. So, yeah, I don't... There was nothing I could find about him going to prison or anything for that. He killed them in self-defense. In the 1930s, the Coronel met his wife, Angela Torres. They adopted a daughter together, whom they named Regulo Robles Torres. And they lived in a quiet town. After the revolution, Amelio had a pretty quiet life. In the 1970s, he received multiple military awards for his service in the revolution, including the Mexican Legion of Honor, which I think is one of the highest awards that a soldier in Mexico can receive. So pretty cool. And then he ended up passing away in December of 1984 at the age of 95, lived to a ripe old age.
That's really good.
Yeah. As we mentioned earlier, there's a historian, Gabriela Cano Ortega, who said that Robles' adoption of male identity was not a survival strategy like so many other soldaderas in the revolution. He had a deep conviction of his identity as a man. In fact, there are a lot of stories. Apparently, one of his neighbors at a time, I think this is after the revolution when he's living with his wife and daughter, but I guess one of their neighbors had multiple stories of if anyone had ever, tried to refer to him as a woman or called him Doña, which is, an honor, a female honorific. It's the feminine version of Dawn. So if anyone tried to refer to him as a woman or call him Doña, he would threaten them with his pistol.
Oh my God.
So deeply held convictions, you know.
Yeah.
And what I think is so cool and interesting about Robles is that his identity was accepted by family, by society, by the Mexican government. He lived as a man legally from the age of 24 when he first started dressing as a man in the revolution until he died. And he had a strong relationship with his army superiors. For instance, General Adrian Castrejon, who, you know, a lot of his superiors ended up being very heavily involved in politics after the revolution. And his strong relationship with, you know, these men in politics allowed his identity to be officially recognized by the government. So, you know, he breaking ground. Now, I say that he was accepted by family, society, and the Mexican government, and that is true. But that's not to say that, like, you know, he never received like pushback or had issues. I mean, we talked about a time where a group of men tried to attack him to figure out whether he was born female or not. So there were obviously pockets of resistance, but by and large, it seems like, you know, I mean, his family accepted him as a man and the government officially recognized him as a man. And, you know, it seems like most of society did, which is pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Prior to the government officially recognizing him, I guess, I don't know if he did it himself or if he had someone else do it. But I guess he carried a forged birth certificate with him.
I'd like to imagine him just like sitting at a bar one day with like a glass of whiskey, like meticulously like copying it, you know, like trying to go through, like get the M just right, you know.
But yeah, in the end, he was commemorated as both a male hero of the revolution as well as an iconographic female warrior, which is interesting. Like I said, he was commemorated as a male hero and he was recognized as a man by the government, but not in all aspects of the government. For example, there was a museum and a public school that were both named after him, but they used his feminine birth name instead.
I have two thoughts on that. The first is that I wonder if that was like a historical decision, so that way like you could track this person, you know, deeper. The second, though, is that that would be the optimistic answer, honestly. It's probably the curator of that museum is transphobic in some way. Because like also, you know, you have to consider like if everyone in his life knows him as Amelio, like it's gonna be a lot easier to find everything, you know, from like Amelio. But
it's
why would you use a birth name?
I don't know. But I do find myself somewhat conflicted about how he's recognized as an iconographic female warrior.
Yeah.
You know, and like there are a lot of groups that count him among the soldaderas. And, you know, I don't know. I think it's an interesting sort of aspect because like one of the great unifiers in this world is death. Obviously, death is the great equalizer. But I think one of the other ones is misogyny, right?
I don't know about that, but go on.
Well, I think like I've often been asked, you know, when I do DEI consulting work, I've often been asked, why is the T part of LGBT not its own thing? Mm-hmm. You know, because the rest of the acronym kind of deals with sexual identity and orientation. And the T, transgender, is more about gender identity and not directly tied to sexual orientation. So why are they grouped together? And they're grouped together because of misogyny and misogynist expectation of gender, right? Mm-hmm. That men are one way, women are the other, and gay men aren't doing masculinity right because they're too feminine, and lesbians aren't doing femininity right because they're too masculine. And trans people are all over the place. You know, it all comes down to it all comes from misogyny, right? Mm-hmm. And
down with the patriarchy. Free the nipple.
I just, you know, I feel like there is something to the recognition of Amelio as a female warrior, because on the one hand, he does break that misogynistic boundary that the other soldaderas did as well.
Yep.
even if he isn't a woman himself.
Right.
So I don't know, it's interesting. I find myself slightly conflicted because, he's not a woman, but at the same time, he still breaks that boundary that the other women did. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about that?
I think he's a strong man who drinks his whiskey and forges birth certificates.
Sure.
No, I think he's great. I mean, like, honestly, like, the dude deserves all the recognition that he can get. Like, maybe I don't know, like, I'm, just picking out straws here, but, like, maybe other people thought that as well, and they knew that there wouldn't be any recognition from the male side of, from, like, the male side of things. So they knew that he needed to be recognized, so they threw him into the female camp. But like, I mean, he was like running battalions. Like, the dude deserves all sorts of recognition. I mean, oh God, just fucking gender shouldn't exist. That's what I think.
I think one thing is pretty clear, that Colonel Robles was a hero of the Mexican Revolution.
A badass hero.
Yeah, he was. So I would love to have met and like picked his brain.
Yeah.
So he just seems like such a cool, I don't know, just like a cool revolutionary dude.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for listening. If you like what we do here, you can find us on Blue Sky. You can support us on Patreon. On Patreon, we have exclusive content, ad-free episodes, extended cuts. So you can hear all of our crazy tangents and whatnot, plenty of which were probably cut out of this episode, unless you're listening to this on Patreon right now. You can find other episodes on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, as well as directly on our website. So with that, thank you all for joining us. I'm Danielle Gonzalez.
Danny, I found a dog. I found a dog on Google Maps.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.